Chris Paul leaving yet another NBA team and then making noise about it on social media has set tongues wagging across every corner of the basketball internet. The reaction from the 12-time All-Star has people split right down the middle on whether this is justified frustration or something else entirely. So let us walk through exactly what happened with Chris Paul, why he got let go, and what he did next. To understand why Chris Paul's reaction made headlines, you first have to understand the phone call. In the NBA, there is no moment more humbling than the one where a front office tells a player his services are no longer needed. For a player of Chris Paul's stature, a player who has been named to the All-NBA team on multiple occasions, who has led the league in assists on multiple occasions, and who has been called the point guard by fans and media alike for the better part of 2 decades, that phone call carries a weight that most people outside the league cannot fully comprehend. Chris Paul was informed by the San Antonio Spurs that the organization would be moving on from him. The Spurs, led by head coach Greg Popovich's staff, and a front office laser-focused on building around generational talent Victor Wembanyama, made the decision that CP3's tenure in San Antonio had reached its end. The veteran point guard had signed with the Spurs ahead of the 2024-25 season, with a specific understanding. He was supposed to be the veteran voice in the locker room. He was supposed to help mentor Wembanyama and the other young players on the roster. He was supposed to bring championship-level habits to a franchise in the early stages of a rebuild, and by most accounts, he did all of those things. Chris Paul showed up every single day. He worked with the young players. He brought his meticulous preparation habits, the same habits that have made him one of the most respected floor generals in NBA history. He studied film. He organized team dinners. He did everything that a veteran leader is supposed to do on a rebuilding team. But here's the thing about the NBA. Doing everything right does not guarantee that you keep your spot. The Spurs needed roster flexibility. They needed cap space. They needed to open up minutes for younger guards who were part of the long-term vision. And Chris Paul, for all his contributions, was not part of that long-term vision. He was always going to be a short-term addition, a bridge between the Spurs' rebuild phase and their contention phase. Reports indicated that the Spurs explored trade options for Chris Paul before ultimately deciding to waive him. Multiple teams were contacted. There were conversations. But the market for a 39-year-old point guard, even one with the resume of Chris Paul, was not exactly overflowing with demand. Teams respected what CP3 could still do on the court. His basketball IQ remained elite. His ability to run an offense, to get players in the right spots, to control tempo, all of that was still intact. But the legs were not what they used to be. The burst was not what it used to be. And in a league that was getting younger and faster by the season, the clock was working against him in a way it never had before. So the Spurs made the call, and Chris Paul, after spending months investing in that locker room, in those young players, in that organization, was told it was over. Again, this was not the first time Chris Paul had been in this position, not even close. In fact, what made this particular moment so charged was the sheer repetition of it. Chris Paul had been traded from the Los Angeles Clippers to the Houston Rockets. He had been traded from the Rockets to the Oklahoma City Thunder. He had been traded from the Thunder to the Phoenix Suns. He had been moved from the Suns in a deal that sent him to the Washington Wizards, who promptly waived him so he could sign with the Golden State Warriors. And then after one season with the Warriors, he was on the move again, landing in San Antonio. And now San Antonio was telling him to pack his bags too. For a player who prides himself on control, on preparation, on having a plan, for every situation on the basketball court, the lack of control over his own career trajectory had to sting. Chris Paul has always been the player who sees 3 plays ahead. He has always been the player who knows where everyone is supposed to be before they know it themselves. But no amount of basketball IQ can control front office decisions. No amount of film study can prevent a general manager from deciding that the roster needs to go in a different direction. The timing of the move added another layer to the situation. The Spurs did not wait until the end of the season to make this decision. They made it during the season, which meant that Chris Paul was left in a position where he had to figure out his next move, while the rest of the league was already deep into its rotations and rosters. Finding a new home mid-season is difficult for any player. For a player in the final stretch of his career, it is even more so. And it was in the immediate aftermath of this decision that Chris Paul did what the title of this video suggests. He went, for lack of a better term, a little crazy. Within hours of the news breaking that Chris Paul was no longer a member of the San Antonio Spurs, the internet got its first taste of CP3's response. And it was not the quiet, dignified, corporate non-answer that many expected from one of the most media-savvy players in the league. Chris Paul took to social media with a series of posts that immediately grabbed attention. He posted workout videos that showed him going through intense drills, at a level that made it clear he was not ready to walk away from the game. These were not casual, light jog on the treadmill, stay in shape type workouts. These were full intensity, game speed, sweat pouring down the face sessions that sent a direct message to every front office in the league: I am not done. Chris Paul posted clips on Instagram showing himself running full court drills, hitting mid-range jumpers, and executing the kind of passing sequences that remind everyone why he earned the nickname Point God. The posts racked up millions of views. Comments flooded in from current players, former players, fans, and media members. The consensus was clear. Whatever the Spurs thought about Chris Paul's future, Chris Paul himself had a very different opinion, but the social media posts were just the beginning. In the days that followed, Chris Paul sat down for interviews and made statements that carried a level of raw honesty that was unusual for him. Throughout his career, CP3 has been calculated in his public comments. He has been diplomatic, he has been careful. He has been the president of the National Basketball Players Association, a role that requires political skill and the ability to choose words with precision. But this time, the filter came off, at least partially. In one interview, Chris Paul addressed the pattern of being moved from team to team and made it clear that he believed the narrative around his career had been shaped unfairly. He talked about how he had done everything asked of him at every stop. He talked about how he had accepted every role change, every new set of teammates, every new coaching staff, and had produced at every single one of those stops. He pointed to his numbers. He pointed to the winning records of teams he had been on. He pointed to the fact that he had never once been the reason a team fell apart. Chris Paul told reporters that he felt the constant movement was not a reflection of his performance, but of circumstances beyond his control. He mentioned the salary cap implications, the front office shakeups, the coaching changes, the organizational pivots that happened around him. And he was not wrong. At every stop, the reasons for Chris Paul's departure had more to do with the team's financial and strategic calculations than with anything CP3 was or was not doing on the court. The interview clips went viral. Sports talk shows spent entire segments debating whether Chris Paul was right to speak out, or whether he should have handled it quietly. Some analysts praised him for being honest. Others suggested that this kind of public reaction might make teams less interested in signing him. But Chris Paul was not done. He also reached out to players around the league, and several of them went public with their support. Teammates from previous stops, guys who had played with CP3 on the Clippers, the Rockets, the Thunder, the Suns, the Warriors, and the Spurs, all came out and backed him up. They talked about his leadership. They talked about his work ethic. They talked about the impact he had on their careers. Former teammate Devin Booker posted on social media showing support for Chris Paul, calling him one of the greatest teammates he had ever had. Other players echoed similar sentiments. The basketball community rallied around CP3 in a way that made it clear. Whatever the front offices thought, the players themselves recognized what Chris Paul brought to a team. Chris Paul also made appearances at basketball events and camps during this period, and at each one, he was greeted like a hero. Fans showed up in his jerseys from every team he had played for. Kids lined up for autographs. And CP3, to his credit, showed up with the same energy and professionalism he has always shown. He worked with young players. He ran drills. He gave speeches about perseverance and about not letting anyone tell you when your time is up. The combination of the workout videos, the interviews, the social media activity, and the public appearances created a narrative that took on a life of its own. Chris Paul was not going quietly. Chris Paul was making noise, and the basketball world was paying attention. To truly understand why Chris Paul's reaction to being let go by the Spurs hit so hard, you need to look at the full picture of his career. Because what happened in San Antonio was not an isolated incident. It was the latest chapter in a story that has repeated itself over and over again. Throughout CP3's time in the NBA, Chris Paul entered the league in 2005 as the 4th overall pick by the then New Orleans Hornets. From the moment he stepped onto an NBA court, it was obvious that he was special. He won Rookie of the Year. He made the All-Star team by his 2nd season. By his 3rd season, he was widely regarded as the best point guard in the league. He led the Hornets to the 2nd round of the playoffs and earned his first All-NBA first-team selection. But New Orleans could never build a roster around him that was good enough to contend for a championship. The franchise struggled with injuries to key players, front office instability, and the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which had displaced the team to Oklahoma City for a season. Chris Paul gave everything he had to that organization, but eventually he asked for a trade. What followed was one of the most infamous moments in NBA history. Chris Paul was initially traded to the Los Angeles Lakers, in a deal that would have paired him with Kobe Bryant, But the trade was vetoed by then NBA Commissioner David Stern, who was acting as the de facto owner of the Hornets at the time. The veto sent shockwaves through the league and fundamentally altered the trajectory of Chris Paul's career. Instead of going to the Lakers, he was traded to the Los Angeles Clippers. In Los Angeles, Chris Paul formed Lob City with Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan. The Clippers became one of the most exciting teams in the league. They won playoff series. They packed Staples Center. They turned a franchise that had been a punchline for decades into a legitimate contender, but they could never get over the hump. The second round of the playoffs became a wall that CP3 could not break through, and after 6 seasons, the Clippers traded him to the Houston Rockets. In Houston, Chris Paul teamed up with James Harden. In their first season together, the Rockets won 65 games and came within 1 game of the NBA Finals. They had the Golden State Warriors, the defending champions, on the ropes in the 2018 Western Conference Finals. They were up 3-2 in the series, and then Chris Paul injured his hamstring in Game 5. He missed Game 6 and 7. The Rockets lost both. The Warriors went on to win the championship. That hamstring injury might be the single most pivotal moment in Chris Paul's career. If he stays healthy, there is a legitimate argument that the Rockets beat the Warriors, and CP3 gets his ring. But he did not stay healthy, and the opportunity slipped away. The following season, the relationship between Paul and Harden deteriorated. Reports emerged that the two stars were not getting along, with tensions building throughout the 2018-19 season. The Rockets traded Chris Paul to the Oklahoma City Thunder in the deal that brought Russell Westbrook to Houston. In Oklahoma City, something remarkable happened. Chris Paul, who many had written off as washed, led the Thunder to the playoffs. He was named to the All-Star team. He was one of the best players in the league that season. He proved that he still had it. But the Thunder were rebuilding. They traded him to the Phoenix Suns. In Phoenix, Chris Paul led the Suns to the 2021 NBA Finals. For the first time in his career, he was playing for a championship. The Suns took a 2-0 lead over the Milwaukee Bucks. And then, once again, things fell apart. The Bucks stormed back and won 4 straight games to take the series. Chris Paul was left standing on the court, ringless once more. The following seasons in Phoenix saw the team bring in Kevin Durant, which altered the roster construction. The Suns eventually moved on from Chris Paul, sending him to Washington in a trade that was really just a mechanism to get him off the books. The Wizards waived him immediately. He signed with the Golden State Warriors. In Golden State, CP3 was reunited with Steve Kerr's system and played alongside Stephen Curry, but the fit was never quite right. Paul's minutes were inconsistent. The Warriors were trying to find their identity after the dynasty years. And after 1 season, it was clear that Golden State was not going to be the final chapter either. Then came San Antonio. And now, San Antonio had become just another name on the list. The reason Chris Paul's reaction to being waived by the Spurs resonated so deeply is that it touched on one of the most debated topics in all of basketball. Does Chris Paul's lack of a championship ring define his legacy? This is a question that has followed CP3 for the better part of a decade. And depending on who you ask, you will get dramatically different answers. On one side, there are the people who believe that championships are the ultimate measuring stick. They point to the fact that Chris Paul has played 19 NBA seasons and has never won a title. They point to the blown 3-2 lead against the Warriors. They point to the collapse against the Bucks in the finals. They point to the second-round exits with the Clippers. And they argue that a player who has never won the big one cannot be considered a true all-time great, regardless of the individual numbers. On the other side, there are the people who look at the totality of Chris Paul's career and see one of the most accomplished point guards to ever play the game. They point to his 11 All-Star selections. They point to his 9 All-NBA team selections. They point to his 6 steals titles. They point to the fact that he led the league in assists on multiple occasions. They point to his status as one of only a handful of players in NBA history to record more than 11,000 assists. They point to his win-loss record, which is among the best of any point guard in league history. And they argue that the championship argument is reductive and ignores the reality that basketball is a team sport, and that Chris Paul has been let down by circumstances, injuries, and roster construction far more often than he has let down his teams. ESPN's debate show spent multiple segments analyzing where Chris Paul ranks among the greatest point guards ever, with analysts split on whether his ringless career disqualifies him from the top tier. The conversation got heated. Some analysts were emphatic that CP3 belongs in the conversation, with Magic Johnson, John Stockton, Isaiah Thomas, and Stephen Curry. Others were equally emphatic that the lack of a ring puts a ceiling on his legacy, that he cannot break through. Chris Paul himself has addressed this topic on multiple occasions throughout his career, and his response has always been the same. He says He has given everything he has to every team he has played for. He says he has left it all on the court every single night. He says he has no regrets about how he has played the game, but you could see in his reaction to the Spurs situation that the weight of the narrative was getting to him. When you are 39 years old and you have been told by yet another team that they are moving on from you, and you know that the clock is ticking on your career, and you know that the one thing that everyone keeps holding against you is the one thing you have the least individual control over, it makes sense that the frustration would boil over. What made Chris Paul's reaction so notable was not just the intensity of it, but the specificity. He was not just venting. He was making a case. He was laying out evidence. He was pointing to his contributions at every stop and daring anyone to tell him where he had failed. And the truth is, when you look at the record, it is hard to argue with him. At every single stop in his career, Chris Paul made the team around him better. That is not opinion. That is backed by data. His on-off court numbers, the difference in how a team performs when he is on the floor versus when he is off it, have been among the best in the league for the entirety of his career. He makes players better. He makes organizations better. He elevates everyone around him. The problem is that in the NBA, the player who elevates everyone around him is not always the player who gets the credit. The credit goes to the player who hits the game-winning shot, who dunks over someone on a poster, who drops 50 points in a finals game. Chris Paul's contributions have always been quieter than that. They show up in the way the offense flows, in the way the younger players develop, in the way the team executes in the fourth quarter. But those things do not always translate to highlights and headlines, and so the legacy debate continues. And Chris Paul, by going public with his frustration, essentially threw gasoline on a fire that was already burning. The question that everyone was asking in the aftermath of Chris Paul's public reaction was a simple one. What happens now? At 39 years old, with 19 seasons of NBA basketball on his body, Chris Paul was facing a reality that every great athlete eventually faces. The end was closer than the beginning. The question was whether the end was here right now, or whether there was still one more chapter left to write. Multiple reports surfaced in the days following the Spurs' decision, indicating that several teams had expressed interest in Chris Paul. Contending teams looking for veteran leadership and playoff experience reportedly reached out to Paul's representatives to gauge his interest. The appeal was obvious. Even at this stage of his career, Chris Paul brought things to the table that very few players in the league could match. His understanding of the game was unparalleled. His ability to manage a game, to control pace, to get teammates involved, to execute in the clutch, those skills had not eroded the way his athleticism had. For teams in the middle of a playoff push, adding Chris Paul was not about what he could do in the regular season. It was about what he could do in April, May, and June. It was about having a player on the roster who had been in every big game situation imaginable, and who would not shrink when the moment arrived. Chris Paul has his critics, and many of them are vocal, but nobody has ever accused him of not being prepared. There was also the broadcasting angle. Multiple networks had reportedly expressed interest in Chris Paul as a television analyst. Whenever he decided to hang up his sneakers, reports indicated that ESPN and other networks had conversations with CP3's team about potential broadcasting roles. And this made complete sense. Chris Paul's basketball IQ, his ability to break down the game, his communication skills honed through years as the president of the Players Association, all of these made him a natural fit for television. But Chris Paul made it clear, through his workouts, through his interviews, through his social media posts, that retirement was not on his mind. Not yet. He wanted to play. He believed he could still contribute at a high level. And the workout videos he was posting seemed to back that up. He looked good. He looked sharp. He looked like a player who still had something left in the tank. The broader NBA community seemed split on what the right move was. Some argued that Chris Paul should sign with a contender and make one last run at the championship that has eluded him his entire career. The idea of CP3 joining a team that was already on the cusp and providing that final piece of veteran leadership was appealing to many fans. They wanted to see him get his ring. They wanted the storybook ending. Others argued that Chris Paul should think about the bigger picture. His legacy was secure regardless of whether he won a championship. He had nothing left to prove on the basketball court. His numbers spoke for themselves. His impact on the game spoke for itself. His influence on younger players, many of whom have credited him with helping shape their careers, spoke for itself. Why risk another situation where a team brings you in and then decides to move on? Why put yourself through that again? Chris Paul's business ventures also played into the conversation. He had built a significant portfolio of investments and business interests outside of basketball. He was involved in media production. He was involved in community work. He had interest in the tech space. The post-basketball life was not going to be a problem for Chris Paul. From a financial or fulfillment standpoint, he had set himself up for success beyond the court, in a way that many athletes never do. But here is the thing about competitors. True competitors do not walk away, because the smart move is to walk away. True competitors walk away when they physically cannot do it anymore. And Chris Paul, by every indication, could still do it. His body was still holding up. His mind was still sharp. His desire was still there. The reaction to being let go by the Spurs was not the reaction of a player who was ready to retire. It was the reaction of a player who felt disrespected. It was the reaction of a player who believed he still had value, and who was frustrated that the league did not seem to agree. It was the reaction of a player who had spent his entire career controlling every aspect of his game, and who was now being reminded, yet again, that there are some things you simply cannot control. Whether Chris Paul signs with another team, or whether the Spurs situation turns out to be the final chapter, one thing is undeniable. The man cares. He cares deeply about the game. He cares about his legacy. He cares about being respected for what he has accomplished. And when that respect is not forthcoming, he is not the type to sit quietly and accept it. The workout videos keep coming. The phone calls with other teams keep happening. The debate about his legacy keeps raging on sports talk shows and social media timelines. And Chris Paul, the point guard, the 12-time All-Star, the player who has done everything in this league except win a championship, is making it clear that he is not ready for the story to end. Not like this. Not on someone else's terms. The NBA has a long history of veteran players who refused to go quietly. Some of them found one last moment of glory. Some of them did not. But all of them shared the same trait, an unwillingness to let someone else write the final chapter of their story. Chris Paul, based on everything he has shown us in the weeks since the Spurs let him go, is firmly in that category. In the basketball world, whether they are fans of CP3 or critics of CP3, cannot look away, because when a player of that caliber decides to make some noise, the noise tends to be loud. And right now, Chris Paul is being very, very loud. The next chapter has not been written yet, but if Chris Paul has anything to say about it, and he clearly does, it is going to be written on his terms. The point guard is not done talking, and based on those workout videos, he is not done playing either.